Why did some of the greatest minds in history prefer solitude? What made brilliant thinkers feel repelled by social life? And is isolation a curse or a privilege reserved for the intellectually gifted? Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most pessimistic yet visionary philosophers of the 19th century, had an answer to these questions, and it wasn't flattering to society. For him, the world was crowded with shallow people, driven by petty impulses, trapped in trivial conversations and empty distractions. True genius, by its very nature, demanded distance from this mediocre spectacle. As he once wrote, "Solitude is the fate of all exceptional spirits." But was he right? Or was this contempt for social life just a symptom of being unable to connect with others? Think of names like Nikola Tesla, Emily Dickinson, or Isaac Newton, all known for their brilliance, and just as famously for their isolation. Were they proof that intelligence transcends the ordinary, or were they simply misunderstood souls condemned to wander alone? Today, we'll dive into Schopenhauer's ideas to understand why intelligent people seem to care less about social life, and whether that's really an advantage or just a sophisticated form of alienation. Now that you're reflecting on this, let's move to the first key point. Imagine a genius completely absorbed in his own thoughts, lost in complex theories, while the world around him goes on. While others chat idly about the weather, he's pondering the destiny of humanity. While people argue over small matters, he's searching for the nature of existence. Inevitably, he ends up isolated. Schopenhauer believed this distance wasn't really a choice, but rather an unavoidable consequence of intellectual superiority. The more someone stands out mentally, the harder it becomes to find true peers with whom they can share deep ideas and feelings. In his view, higher intelligence builds a natural barrier between an individual and society, because the concerns of the majority are radically different from those who see the world on a broader scale. He wrote, "A man can only be himself while he is alone. If he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, for it is only when he is alone that he is truly free." For Schopenhauer, solitude wasn't just a burden. It was a refuge. He saw society as a place where intellect was often suffocated by social expectations and trivial interests. Schopenhauer observed that those with greater intellect often felt out of place when interacting with ordinary society. They saw beyond the obvious, grasping realities that most people couldn't even imagine. This kind of isolation can be seen throughout history in countless brilliant figures. Nikola Tesla, for example, spent much of his life alone, avoiding human contact whenever possible because he believed it interfered with his work. Friedrich Nietzsche, another thinker who valued solitude, once said, "The crowd is a sea in which free spirits drown." But this separation came with a price. The need to distance themselves from social conventions often led to feelings of alienation. Schopenhauer understood this dilemma. He knew solitude could be liberating for great minds, but it could also weigh heavily on the soul. That's why so many intellectual giants throughout history endured periods of depression and anxiety. Not because they were weak, but because they saw the world in ways that others simply couldn't. And so the question arises, is this isolation a curse or a blessing? For Schopenhauer, the answer was clear. He believed that great thinkers should accept solitude as a gift. Only in silence, far from the mediocrity of social life, could they reach their greatest achievements. He didn't see social life as a place of genuine exchange or authentic connection. Instead, he described it as a vast theater where people endlessly performed roles, hiding their true intentions behind carefully crafted masks. For most, sociability was nothing more than a disguise, an act to conceal their banality. This pessimistic vision connected directly to his major work, The World as Will and Representation, where he argued that everything we perceive is merely a projection of our mind. In his eyes, social life was nothing but an illusion, a distraction keeping people from real knowledge about themselves and the world. According to Schopenhauer, most people lived trapped in trivial concerns, status, gossip, petty struggles for power and recognition. The average human, in his view, was enslaved by the will, a blind, irrational force that governs our actions and keeps us chained to endless desires. The pursuit of social validation, he argued, was nothing more than a reflection of this uncontrollable will. Meanwhile, those with sharper intellects saw things differently, sometimes cruelly so. To them, society appeared like a hollow game, where interactions rarely scratched beneath the surface. And Schopenhauer wasn't alone. Other great thinkers also expressed disdain for society's superficiality. Nietzsche, for instance, claimed, "Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies." In other words, people prefer clinging to illusions rather than facing reality with honesty. This tension between the pursuit of truth and the demands of social life created an unbridgeable gap between the brightest minds and the rest of humanity. The result, intellectual isolation, became inevitable. But there's a side effect. Prolonged solitude can lead to disillusionment, apathy, and even contempt for the outside world. Schopenhauer was aware of this. He warned that for those who saw beyond society's illusions, the only real alternative was to accept that reality and learn to live with it. But how does this isolation show up in everyday life? Why do people with greater intelligence so often feel frustrated in social interactions? Schopenhauer didn't mince words. To him, most people were guided by shallow, selfish interests, with little or no inclination toward contemplation or deep thought. This created an inevitable gap between those with elevated intelligence and the masses he saw as distracted by trivialities and nonsense. Mediocrity, he argued, usually only recognizes itself. Genius, on the other hand, sees mediocrity, but finds itself alone. Intellectual isolation arises because the thinker naturally seeks to understand the world in depth, while most others are concerned with status, gossip, or fleeting entertainment. The genius is busy untangling the mysteries of existence, and when he tries to share his ideas, he often encounters indifference or outright incomprehension. This explains why so many great thinkers felt frustrated with society. Schopenhauer himself despised mixing with ordinary people, convinced that the mediocrity of the majority stifled the brilliance of the few. This thought echoes in Voltaire's famous line, "The secret of being boring is to tell everything." The problem wasn't just communication, it was a clash of interests. The genius searches for universal truths, while the majority seeks only pleasure and distraction. For Schopenhauer, this intellectual imbalance made social life a burden for the elevated mind. We can see this dynamic in countless historical figures. Nikola Tesla, for instance, avoided social events and trivial interactions, considering them a waste of time. Isaac Newton was notorious for his reclusiveness and impatience with small talk. Even Albert Einstein, one of the most celebrated scientists in history, admitted he preferred solitude over the company of people uninterested in deeper ideas. But here's the twist. This distance from society isn't always by choice. Many times, society itself rejects those who think differently. Innovative, unconventional ideas often trigger discomfort and resistance. Nietzsche called this the resentment of mediocrity, the tendency of ordinary people to scorn and attack what they don't understand, or what makes them feel inferior. Thus, the genius doesn't just withdraw by his own will, he is also pushed away by the hostility of the world around him. This forced solitude can lead to alienation and sometimes to outright disdain for social life. So that raises a crucial question. If the world is hostile to great thinkers, how should they face this reality? Schopenhauer believed there was a solution, and it wasn't about trying to fit into society. Instead, It was about embracing solitude and cultivating it as a refuge for thought and contemplation. So, is solitude a destiny or a choice? For Schopenhauer, it was both. He saw isolation as the inevitable result of higher intelligence, but also as an opportunity for intellectual and spiritual growth. The ordinary man, he wrote, cannot bear to be alone because he only feels at ease in the company of others. The higher man seeks solitude because it is there that he finds himself. This brings us to an essential point. Solitude isn't a punishment, it's a privilege. It offers the thinker the chance to immerse himself in his own ideas, without distractions, without the need to conform to the empty conventions that dominate daily life. It's in that silent space that creativity blooms and true understanding deepens. Many of history's greatest thinkers, scientists, and artists made solitude their inseparable companion. Emily Dickinson spent most of her life secluded in her home, devoting herself entirely to writing. Kant was famous for his strict routine and his disregard for social events. Beethoven, as his deafness worsened, found in isolation the strength to create some of the most powerful symphonies ever composed. For Schopenhauer, solitude not only allowed deeper thought, but also preserved the authenticity of genius. Getting too entangled in society risked drowning the brilliant mind in distraction and clouding its vision. This perspective resonates strongly with Buddhist thought, one of Schopenhauer's key influences. Buddhism teaches that attachment to the external world and to social interactions often brings suffering. True growth comes through introspection and detachment from the illusions of the material world. Yet, here lies the dilemma. Human beings are, by nature, social animals. The need to belong is wired into us. Prolonged solitude can create anguish and melancholy. Even the greatest thinkers, no matter how much they valued isolation, suffered from the lack of meaningful human connection. Nietzsche, for instance, who also saw solitude as a path to greatness, admitted it could be painful. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he describes the philosopher as a hermit descending from the mountain to share his wisdom, only to face rejection and misunderstanding. The dilemma is real. Stepping away from society brings freedom, but it also carries an existential weight that's hard to bear. Schopenhauer, however, believed there was a way out. While a genius might never truly fit in with society, he could still interact with the world without being consumed by its mediocrity. The solution? Adopting philosophical detachment, a kind of emotional neutrality that allows one to coexist with others, without being overly entangled. And that leads us to the final question. How can someone navigate the world without being swallowed by its superficiality? If having a brilliant mind means ending up alone, how did the great thinkers manage to live in society without feeling suffocated by it? For Schopenhauer, the answer lay in a simple strategy: detachment, or, as he might put it, good old philosophical distance. Happiness, he wrote, belongs to those who are self-sufficient. The secret wasn't trying to fit in or attempting to change others. Instead, it was about cultivating a calm, detached attitude. Like a scientist observing an experiment, curious, analytical, but never emotionally entangled. That meant accepting the banality of social life without being irritated by it. Understanding the intellectual limits of most people without getting frustrated. And above all, preserving one's independence of thought without feeling the need for external validation. This strategy closely resembles Stoic philosophy. The Stoics taught emotional control in the face of adversity. Marcus Aurelius, one of Stoicism's great figures, wrote in his Meditations, "Give yourself a gift, the gift of indifference to what is beyond your control." The world, Schopenhauer argued, will always be full of empty distractions and meaningless chatter. But it's up to the individual to decide how much attention all that really deserves. The thinker, therefore, shouldn't cut himself off entirely from society. Instead, he should engage with it strategically, absorb only what is useful, discard what is irrelevant. Despite his deep disdain for social life, Schopenhauer didn't believe total isolation was the solution. Even great thinkers, he admitted, needed at least a minimum of human contact, whether to exchange ideas or simply to avoid sinking into absolute loneliness. The key, he said, was to choose carefully whom to connect with and keep interactions to a minimum, just enough to live in the world without going mad. This philosophy still applies today. In a world overflowing with digital distractions, fake news, and shallow relationships, learning to filter both information and interactions is essential. True intelligence, Schopenhauer reminds us, isn't just about understanding the world. It's about knowing how to move through it without losing yourself. Instead of lamenting the lack of connection with most people, we should see it as proof of intellectual freedom. After all, solitude can feel heavy, but it can also be a privilege. A chance to explore our own thoughts without interference. So the big question remains: do you adapt yourself to the world, or do you accept it as it is while preserving your intellectual freedom? If you've followed along this far, you've probably realized that the link between intelligence and isolation isn't just some accident of fate. It's a natural consequence of deep thought. Schopenhauer showed us that the greatest minds often find more comfort in solitude than in the company of crowds. Not out of arrogance, but because the superficiality of social interactions can be exhausting for those who see beyond appearances. The smarter a man is, the more likely he is to be alone. But does that mean solitude is the only path? Not necessarily. The key is in seeing solitude not as a punishment, but as a refuge. Being alone doesn't mean being abandoned. It means having time to think, reflect, and grow without the constant noise and pressures of society. Maybe that's the real test of intelligence, knowing how to balance the outside world with inner life. Knowing when to connect and when to step away. Schopenhauer gave us the key to this kind of freedom, but it's up to each of us to decide how to use it. If you've ever felt that strange mix of freedom and isolation he described, you already know intelligence can be both a sanctuary and a prison. There's something deeply liberating in realizing that not every silence needs to be filled, and not every connection is worth pursuing. You're not truly alone in this path, even if it feels lonely. As old Arthur once put it, the problem isn't solitude. The problem is the wrong company. I remember a moment of my own. After spending hours buried in a book, lost in some grand idea, someone interrupted me just to ask if I had caught the latest TV soap opera or the gossip of the week. That was when I realized. It's not arrogance to crave deeper conversations. It's a need. If you've ever felt like you're speaking a different language, your mind sailing in an ocean while others insist on splashing in a puddle, you know the frustration. But here's the bright side. You don't have to drown in the noise. You have the privilege of choosing solitude. So, the next time you feel out of step with the chatter around you, remember, solitude isn't a curse. It's a space where your mind can breathe. And if you value conversations that go beyond the surface, stick around here. There's more to explore, and the journey is only just beginning.